Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome you to our regular Kaffeepause. Today we're joined by Stefan Kornelius. He's the political editor of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Herzlich willkommen, Stefan.
Hello, Steve. Good to see you again.
Well, this has sort of become a little bit of a tradition. It was great to see you at least briefly over the weekend in Munich, and I want to thank you so much for making the time to join us today to share your readout on the Munich Security Conference. But I also want to make sure that we spend some time talking about Sunday's election. I feel like this year, like last year, Vladimir Putin cast a dark shadow over the conference, even though Russia did not attend. Last year, of course, the death of Alexei Navalny was the shocker. This year, I think it was from a different perspective or a different angle. People walked into the conference talking about President Trump's 90-minute phone call with Putin on Wednesday, as well as U.S. Defense Secretary Hegseth's messaging in Brussels. As you try to sort of put into place everything that you heard and observed at the Munich Security Conference this past weekend, what were some of the main topics and themes that you find yourself coming back to?
Well, I mean, you touched upon them, and I don't want to be judgmental right now, but the main topics were definitely what state of relations are we in? How is the new administration presenting herself, not only in Munich, but to their allies in Europe? Because this was the first week where the allies basically hit this continent and made themselves heard. It was the war in Ukraine, and rightly, Vladimir Putin's always in the room. Strangely enough, the biggest stunner for the German audience was definitely the vice president's speech, where he reprimanded Germany for accusingly being using censorship and free speech, anti-free speech tactics to silence their opponents on the political right. He was openly siding with the right-wing German AfD and actually meeting their lead candidate for the elections right after the speech. So that was about kind of a domestic stunner, but the international main issue was what actually is unfolding with Ukraine. And as you rightly say, there was so much to process over the past days, so many parallel developments and things one had to put in perspective that you could almost get dizzy at Munich, because even from the US administration, or probably I should scrap even, but from the US administration, we had very conflicting views and messages. And it only evolved over the weekend that the Riyadh meeting was about to take place, that the questionnaire was sent to Europeans about their abilities to contribute to a peace process, so on and so forth. So that was a highly frantic and hyped political atmosphere, extremely confusing and tiring at this point as well.
I mean, I agree with you completely, and I'm sure that many in our audience have read extensively about the vice president's speech and what a shock it really was. It sort of sucked all of the air out of the room, all of the attention, at least for the next day or so, as people then started to digest it. What was interesting was he did not, I think he mentioned Ukraine once. He did not really talk about Ukraine or Ukraine policy. And I think a lot of the Europeans that certainly I was talking to were hoping that the vice president would use his speech to sort of explain some of the contradictory messaging that people have been hearing about Ukraine. Do you feel like the Europeans, and particularly the Germans, sort of overreacted to Vance's speech?
It's definitely a new tone. It reminded me a bit of the period when we were getting to know the neocons in Washington, early 2000s, 2005, so on, where the transatlantic tone was also highly loaded, also politically loaded. I was surprised how blunt the attack came along, and forgive me if I use that word, but it was actually really simplistic the way he framed his attack in actually a day after he visited their former concentration camp of Dachau, seemingly not knowing the background of how Germany handles free speech and how we do see what's going on, especially in social media in terms of hate speech and fake news, and how much of a threat to a democracy this can pose, at least from a German perspective, which has a lot of court ruling about these things. Things were seemingly backed by a report on CBS 60 Minutes, we all learned about last night, who took up that theme and gave evidence for German prosecutors going after people who send hate speech and are pretty aggressive on the net. And yes, there are legal measures against these things in Germany, but I think one should put them into perspective and look behind the legal foundation for all of this. And the vice president didn't do any of this, and the lack of not talking about Ukraine added to that confusion. So I guess we saw a vice president who used this opportunity to talk in that hall, not only to address the Germans or to basically shock and awe the Europeans, but also to address the home audience. And this was clearly a speech also given to the president himself, and it was highly applauded in the MAGA camp.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right in pointing out that this speech had multiple audiences and in that case, multiple purposes. I think one of the other issues that I certainly took away and that many Europeans took away was a sense that Europe is not necessarily needed, at least in this phase of negotiations when it comes to trying to have a ceasefire in the war in Ukraine. And that was something that there was a lot of hand-wringing about. In a couple of conversations that I had with Americans, they were more placating in a way and said, look, the Europeans should not be upset that there's not a seat at the table for them yet, because there is no table. And that Trump is basically doing this bilaterally, but that the important takeaway, the important signal is that this is a high priority for the president and that he really wants to get something done. And that, of course, the main issue is that the fighting stops and that the fighting does not start again. And so, that there are some security guarantees in place, but then also around burden sharing. And so, from the variety of conversations and insights that you got at the conference, what do you see as the path forward on Ukraine?
Well, Ukraine is now a truly complex issue, and I agree with what you said, that somehow these negotiations had to start, and they had to start with a bang, and that bang was sounding clearly and nicely. So we heard it. The question, however, is of trust. And trust has a lot to do with how much do you know each other and how much do you know each other's position. And the mistrust or the lack of trust from the European side, and honestly, even more so from the Ukrainians themselves as being the victims of this war, was about not knowing what the Trump position would be and will be in these talks. Now, we can argue this is an ongoing process, and you rightly said there is no table yet. And that's even more frightening, because I think you shouldn't approach such a really crucial and historically challenging situation in an unprepared way, as it now looks like it does, and without being here sort of the victims of all of this, without having the knowledge or having the relief to know what this ultimately would lead to, whether there's a game plan or not. And we clearly saw this is a matter of power, and only the US can muster that kind of strength to address or approach the Russia and force them to a conversation without actually threatening, with just saying otherwise, or if not then, and just leave it open. No Europeans would have done that. It's a bit sad, however, because Europe isn't sort of the least contributor in that whole thing. Europe spends more money than the US does, probably less weapon, but in terms of money, Europe is there. And in that respect, we don't know whether we will face an Afghanistan scenario where the Trump administration sat down in Doha with the Taliban, negotiated a withdrawal time and date, and said, okay, after that we don't care, and basically handed the Taliban a blanco check on what to do with the country. And that could also now happen with Russia in respect to Ukraine. And that's definitely not something neither the Ukrainians nor the Europeans would accept.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, of course, the other thing that people were talking about going into the Munich Security Conference was that it seemed from some of Secretary Hegseth's statements as if the U.S. had already given up some of the key negotiating points, i.e., accepting that or saying that the Ukraine would have to accept that it had lost 20% of its territory, and basically ruling out Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. Both things that could have continued to be, points of negotiation to try to strengthen the Western position when it comes to negotiating a peace.
I'm not quite sure, actually. Those 2 points, I mean, you're right, they were always at the table, but there was so much talk about it, and most of Europe and the Americans have said, and the Biden administration have said before, well, territory is a done deal. Now, the big question is, will it just be accepted that they're occupied, or will there be sort of even a legal acceptance of that? So will there be a withdrawal of borders or not? On the securities and guarantee issue, NATO was sort of the most perfect ideal scenario we would have approached, bring them into NATO and get the NATO shield over Ukraine and the war stops. But for that, you have to be prepared as NATO to step in if war is. And now no one in NATO is, neither the Americans nor the Germans nor elsewise. So those 2 points are basically minor for negotiations. To me, it's much more important what guarantees Ukraine will get now beyond that. Also, will the US negotiate sort of in good faith on behalf of the Ukraine, or will it sort of negotiate for some other goals? And will it just be something lofty as well? I have to be a peacemaker and get a Nobel Peace Prize, which you actually will not get if this peace goes down the road. If it's going sour, there won't be a Nobel Peace Prize. So you have to take sides. And it's basically Vladimir Putin who now calls the shots. We still do the whole negotiating thing amongst us. We are sitting at our table, and we haven't heard a thing from the Russian side at all, except that they now showed up in Riyadh, which is nice. And yeah, let's see. We are really, really in tumultuous waters here, and every day brings huge surprises.
I remember our conversation a year ago after the 2024 Munich Security Conference, and we talked about sort of the sense of urgency or lack of urgency that we heard from some people in terms of addressing the real challenges that exist at the moment. And obviously, for years, we've talked about wake-up calls that have been brought, largely by the Americans, but from others as well, about issues that need to be addressed. I personally had sort of mixed feelings about whether there was a real sense of urgency displayed by European leaders. And of course, one has to distinguish between leaders from the Baltic states and leaders from Scandinavia and leaders from other parts of Europe. Do you think that the Europeans have a heightened sense of urgency after the Vance speech and after this Munich Security Conference?
It truly has changed the landscape, because all of a sudden there's a double threat hanging in the air. It's not only that Russia might get closer and might actually play out its ultimate goal, which is destruct the European security order, which was established over the past decades. So it's not only that threat. The other threat is we might be left on our own. The US might be gone. And this all of a sudden creates a true panic. And so I think this wake-up call is actually a totally overused word, but let's go back. I mean, it's far too, it's not strong enough as from what actually happened. It's a rocking and shaking and earthquaking which is taking place here. So I guess, yes, it's there. But then you have to make a difference. People like the Danish Prime Minister, who's a very strong vocal advocate on the Ukrainian side, well, she cannot really commit to the cause. How many troops will Denmark send? What kind of weaponry can they send? If you look at the figures, they haven't done either. So it boils down to the big ones. we're around here in Germany in the midst of a campaign, you wouldn't find a single politician pledging today to send troops to Ukraine, because that would cost him votes on Sunday. It's an unpopular thing, let's face it. Nobody is prepared to step up to it. It starts with us. Are we prepared to send troops? And strangely, funnily enough, it was Vladimir Zelensky who asked these questions. Zelensky gave the most European leader speech at this thing. He has nothing to lose, so he can confront the audience with a sheer naked truth, and he did that very well.
But, you know, one of the main takeaways from his speech was this call for a European army, and that he has, of course, his battle-hardened Ukrainian soldiers who could be part of that army. But that's not really something that's realistic at this point.
Not. Right.
I mean, I think
yeah, he overstretched on that one. No, he overdid it. I agree. You're fully right. But he basically made the point to tell the Europeans, look, you cannot muster the strength, and you have to commit something. I mean, now we had the Paris meeting yesterday as a follow-up to the conference, or actually to a preview to the Saudi meeting and the Paris conference. Well, they are circling around the same issues, like who should lead a European army, who would be in command, who calls the shots, what's sort of the plan of escalation? Are we all in one boat if it comes to replying to an aggression? What's an aggression? So we're getting down the bureaucratic way of fighting this, and to honor what the Trump administration now did, they really put us out of our comfort zone and made us face those questions. And I think from the American perspective, you have to consider there are 28 countries which have to get their acts together, and this is complicated. They're all sovereign nations. They call upon their own armies. They have their own commander-in-chiefs, and it's not just one. But as a unity, as a unit, as an entity, the European Union has some firepower, both militarily but also economically. That's what we see, for example, on the tariff side.
Right. So this actually raises a question that someone just submitted. Since we're talking about troops being provided, we have a question that reads, the UK Prime Minister has offered to send troops to Ukraine if others do as well. Will the crisis posed by the US bring the United Kingdom and Europe closer together in concrete terms?
It already did. And Starmer was part of the Paris meeting yesterday. So there was no in and out of EU issue. There was just European leaders. And basically, we all knew that defense would be the path where UK would come back to some kind of European decision making. And yes, his pledge to send troops is strong. It is convincing. We know from Macron that he, for more than a year now, tries to push the EU to send troops. He always was sort of talking about this fortress Odessa, for example. And he was getting the same questions as we're now asking. How far are you prepared to go? So if you get under attack from the Russians, are you prepared to go into a war with Russia? Are you? And this is basically what kept most players, including the US, until the Trump administration, out of that game. And the big sort of the tight walk now is to bring Russia to the table, to have serious negotiations without really setting foot on the ground and threatening with shooting.
While we're talking about the role of the United States and sort of the European, but particularly the German response, we have a question from Pittsburgh, from someone who asks whether it's even possible to have a rational conversation with or about the current US administration, and goes on to say, what possible actions or reactions can Germany take that will actually get the attention of the US government now? Is this a time for careful, steady diplomacy and grounded reason, or rather for more theatrical and a more fiery response?
It depends who you talk to. And there's a lot of rational and classic conversation ongoing, let's say, from the German side, Jens Blödner, who's the chief of the security advisor to the chancellor, and Waltz, the national security advisor in Washington, also with the other principals in the European theater. They are talking. Von der Leyen's people are talking to the White House on their levels. The main problem is the decision-making process within the Trump administration is everything what Walz or Rubio or everyone on the table in Rio today are negotiating is that also automatically on Trump's table. So is it part of his decision-making thinking? And we don't know that. And the kind of ad hoc irrationality Trump provided, or Trump basically showed over the past weeks, this is what makes people nervous here. Can we trust him? And now to earn his trust with a couple of paths, and they've all been discussed, and I think they're not wrong. One is spending, and this is a valid point. I mean, whenever I go to that conference for decades now, and there hasn't been a single security conference without a burden sharing issue. And it was always a burden sharing issue. And the other thing is reciprocity in things. And on the trade issue, I guess there is ground to negotiate. And there is ground that the Americans have to learn a couple of truths about the European side and reverse on, let's say, free speech. What we now see in this kind of more ideological exchange or dogmatic exchange on how we treat political political issue like hate speech and things like that. I guess both sides have to respect that they have their own history. American free speech is something entirely different to German and European free speech. We had a high-ranked public civil servant being killed here recently because he was threatened online before, and somebody called for him to be shot. Then he got shot. I mean, this shouldn't actually take place. It is not acceptable.
Yeah. I'd like to come back to German politics in just a moment and talk about the election in less than a week on this coming Sunday. But before I do that, what were some of the other issues that you were following at the MSC? And I'm asking that specifically because we've heard from the Trump administration that issue number one is China, as far as this administration is concerned, when it thinks about threats. I personally did not get as much of a takeaway on China at the conference this year. I was more focused on the transatlantic relationship and on Ukraine, and obviously the Vance speech. But how much of an issue was China at this year's conference from your perspective? And were there other issues that you were following that you would encourage people to think about?
Well, I think China was the white elephant in the room nobody talked about. The Wang Yi, the foreign minister, gave a speech which you could have given a year ago as well, and he might actually have given the same speech. We probably didn't notice. So it's pretty much the same rhetoric all the time. Win-win for all of us. And the hall was remarkably or sadly very empty when he spoke. And well, never mind, he's still coming and he's engaging. There were tons of bilaterals with him. Everyone knows that. With Wang Yi comes trade and comes the question of influence global south. And that was something, if you would have had time, and I share the same way as you did, I just did transatlantic, but there was the big issue on basically also what kind of vacuum does the US leave? Especially if USA is now out of the game, and who's filling it? And I can guess twice who that is. That's China. And you heard that from whoever you wanted to talk to. So trade, the global balance issues on the tectonic shifts we do see, they're on the table. And funny enough, if you talk to EU officials, I mean, they have a to-do list now of, a dozen whatever states who want to do closer trade relations on a contract basis, free trade agreements, because they see how the ends turn loose on the global, on the big picture scene. So they want to have some safety.
So the Munich Security Conference ended on Sunday, and of course Sunday evening was a quadrille, a television debate between the four top leading candidates for chancellor in German politics. And I mean, obviously, Vice President Vance's speech was a key topic of discussion in the debate, but so was the economy, obviously immigration at the moment, Ukraine, defense spending, issues around housing, pensions. So, foreign policy, but very much domestic issues. And I think that the debate was probably unlikely to have had a significant impact on voters, but given what I've been reading, that more than 30% of voters are still undecided a week ahead of time, even a small shift could make a big difference. Ahead of the television debate, the CDU had been polling at about 30%, the Alternative for Germany, AfD, at 20%, the Social Democrats at 15%, the Greens at 13%, and the Left Party, the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, and the FDP, all sort of at the 5% threshold plus minus, with lots of questions about whether those three parties would make it in. It looks like the Left Party will pass the 5% hurdle. It's not so clear for the other two. As you watched the debate between Chancellor Olaf Scholz for the SPD, Friedrich Merz for the CDU, Robert Habeck for the Greens, and Alice Weidel for the AfD, what were some of the main takeaways that you had? Because this was really one of the few opportunities that voters have had to see the candidates interact directly with each other.
Well, it was the only opportunity they had to see the four of them. I mean, there are plenty of other opportunities. We had a couple of debates just between the Chancellor, Scholz, and the CDU, so the number 3 ranking guy and the leader in the polls right now. So that kind of format thing is a big debate here in Germany, because it all goes around the same question. How should we engage with the AfD? The AfD is now polling at 20%, as you say, and that's huge. I mean, they almost doubled their result. They grow and grow, and all of a sudden, this week, also past days, the AfD is in all sort of on all screens. It's extremely present. So for me, the most interesting part to watch was how Weidel is doing in such a group, in such a round, and she was definitely playing the role of the outsider, of the sort of the pin which stings everyone. She was extremely aggressive. She was sharp and in no way conciliatory in her tone. And now German politics. It is extremely about tiptoeing around things and not really being too blunt. This is not an American style of debate. It's a more German thing, because in the end, you see each other twice. You have to compromise. You have to form coalitions. She clearly said no. She's out to get the vote. She's out to steer anger, to create trouble. And that was felt. I think most viewers feel awkward watching that. That's a German thing, but they do. And they don't like that kind of aggressiveness. So basically, it was 3 against 1. It was the 3 from the more centrist parties against Weidel from the right wing, and so people could make up their mind. The overall issue in the campaign, and mostly it's now migration, and then are helping the AfD because they have the most radical position on it. We should have mentioned it 2 days before the Munich conference started. We had this horrific attack here in Munich by an Afghan asylum seeker who crashed his car into a protest march and killed 2 people and hurt another 10. And so that's occupying people's mind right now.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess in that vein, what is likely, do you think, to have more of an impact on voters? The attack that you just described, which was on Thursday morning, just as people were getting ready for the Munich Security Conference, or Vance's speech?
Vance's speech has a kind of an indirect paying into the same coffers. I mean, it's basically backing the AfD. It's saying you shouldn't cancel them. I mean, nobody cancels them, but we basically take them, as I would say, and as a journalist, from our value base, or from our value thing, which we have. Well, they are a right-wing extremist party, partly watched by the German National Security Services, legally branded as being basically a Nazi party. And now, given Germany's past, Germany was spared a lot of this right-wing extremism things over the past years. We've seen them rising all over Europe and in the US, and now they're also here in Germany. And we're not surprised that we see hundreds of thousands out on the streets voicing their anger about that, voicing their opposition to that, and saying we will not tolerate that this country goes south again. And so, yes, this is all turning into a vote of how strong will the AfD be, but this again is helping the AfD because their anti-establishment argument, their argument against the elite, as they frame it, sticks with a lot of people, and the vice president fueled exactly that debate.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. The vice president's statement sort of fueled that, but we've also seen some respondents to some interviews, and in, I guess there haven't really been that many surveys that have been released yet, but the sense that I had from talking to people was it could actually support the Christian Democrats, because there are a number of people who have an allergic reaction to the thought of working with the AfD. But
I mean, you ask about the poll effects, and I think yes, I mean, they're now roughly 30% not decided, which is a lot, but we have seen that figure climbing down from 45 to 30 within a week, and the polls really haven't shifted. So the polls are fairly accurate in anticipating how those undecided go in the end.
Well, the polls, I think it's fair to say, have been very consistent. But the question that I had even before I arrived in Munich, so before the attack and before Vance's speech, was how reliable the 20% AfD vote might be, or whether it couldn't be higher than that, given that it's not quite fully acceptable to say that you're an AfD voter. So even
what that has changed, and the pollsters do say now people are openly confessing what they do. The AfD is not longer a thing to be ashamed of for most of those who vote for them, so they confess. And yes, you're right. I mean, this is the speculation. Is there this sort of unseen pocket of undecided voters? It could also tap in for the CDU. The SPD is remarkably low at 14 or 15. Yeah. That's quite unusual. So they hope for some last minute change. It's now a week, and we don't know how quickly events fold in. In the end, let me say one thing, or probably the decisive thing. First, it's about mobilization. How many go out and vote? And second, it is, and the weather will be fair. We'll have 11 degrees centigrade and sunshine, so that should be. It's not a bad weather mode. And the other thing is,
and there's no marathon this time.
There's no marathon, and and the other thing is, it depends. And you perfectly pointed to the small parties and the 5% hurdle. The more get into parliament, the more difficult it'll become to form a government. So the less come in. So if it's only the Linkspartei, then the CDU might be able just to form a government with the Social Democrats or even the Greens and have the choice. If the Linkspartei drops out, even better. If all of the other small ones get in, it's almost impossible to have a two-way coalition. So then again, we are stuck with a three-way coalition, and that will be the end of all reform attempts. And that'll be sort of the frozen center, which is unable to move and to shake and to do things what people actually do expect. So that's would be the big disappointment. So I wish all parties luck, but luck could also fulfill itself below 5%.
So in light of that, given that really immigration and public safety are one topic issue, but also the state of the German economy is one key issue as people deal with inflation, as there are concerns about pension system, for example. Obviously, a discussion about Germany's debt brake and how to handle that. I guess two questions. One is sort of how did these issues play out in the debate? But also, how are they playing out more broadly among voters as they think about the election on Sunday?
They are constantly there. The economy is a huge issue. The parties tackle that issue rather sort of practical, or sort of in a constructive way, making proposals what to do, but it's not abused ideologically. So right now, it's not sort of the hot debating point. And Olaf Scholz tries to turn it that way by pointing to the truth, which there is that the foreign policy situation demands of Germany to spend so much more on defense that there will be a huge impact on the budget, on the way what we spend, and on having sort of a special budget and borrowing more. And he's right with that. But I think people have already filtered that in. That's already part of the knowledge that things will become even more difficult. So they look for a leader type. This is why Merz gets those higher approval ratings, and he's not a fresh face. And Scholz will not turn things around with pointing to the economy, which he actually mishandled or badly handled for 3 years.
Mm-hmm. So obviously for weeks at this point, Friedrich Merz's name has been touted as the next chancellor of Germany, and it really just looks the big question is, with whom will his Christian Democrats form a government? Will it be with the Social Democrats in another grand coalition, or will it be with the Greens if there is just a two-party governing coalition, or what could a three-party coalition look like? It was interesting in the immediate aftermath after the debate that obviously Merz emerged as the winner of the debate with a Forza poll saying that 32% were in favor of him as the strongest candidate. But I found it interesting that Robert Habeck of the Greens was the most likable, with 34% of respondents saying that they supported him in terms of likability. But nobody seems to have confidence in Habeck as a chancellor, right? Only, I think, 13% trusted him to lead the country, whereas 42% trust Friedrich Merz to lead the country. As you sort of think about the next few days, what are you watching, and who are you watching as the final phase of the election unfolds?
I think you mentioned the main issue. What will the undecided do? And we will have fresh polls on Thursday and Friday, reliable polls for Thursday by ARD, on Forschungsgruppe Wahlen on Saturday, on Friday by the ZDF, and as the most trustworthy polls. We see how that number shrinks. I think nobody will, everyone is now avoiding mistakes, and probably the most remarkable thing of all of this campaign was how disciplined all sides were. Friedrich Merz was remarkably disciplined, given his temper, which he also commands. So it is now sailing to a smooth ending. Let's hope that no attack or anything else happens. To me, it's quite striking that all countries under sort of political stress are suffering now from those attacks. And I know that that all the services are looking into this, whether there's some kind of force behind it, but we haven't really figured out yet. There have been 4 attacks with attackers from migrational background during this campaign. That's remarkably lot. And so let's see. I don't see big issue rising up. The war and peace thing will definitely not affect the campaign too much. To me, surprisingly little foreign policy, a big issue during the campaign. It wasn't flying again. And if it should have, this year would have been the year where we should have talked foreign policy. Ooh, sorry, my light is turning. Okay. This is, so I guess this is, this has been it for the campaign. And I know that all camps are preparing already their negotiating notes. They have their plans ready to go. They will sit together very fast afterwards. They all are committed to do it fast and probably not negotiate a very detailed coalition agreement this time. But before that, I guess we'll have to wait a little bit until the Social Democrats have sorted out their internal leadership problem, which they automatically will have if Scholz resigns. And he's not party chairman, but they have to find sort of a symbolic leader. It might either be the party chairman, or it might be Pistorius as a defense minister. And then they might be ready to go if the party is not in such a shock that they refuse to participate in a government again. But honestly, this time, the stress, the pressure on being a responsible leader is so high that you can't take yourself out of the game.
And so when do you think the coalition negotiations might be finished? When do you think it's likely that a new government will be in place?
Well, they aim at Easter. This is their clearly stated goal. That's 40 days. It's all the Lent period. They should use it wisely and really have to come up fast with a credible leadership. I think it's more about public perception rather than having now a fine-printed to-do plan. We saw what happens to such plans with the last government, which they just negotiated when a week later the war broke out, and everything was toast. So
I mean, I was speaking with a couple of Bundestag members from different parties, and they said, there will probably be a much shorter coalition agreement than there has been in the past. We're not talking about 4 or 5 pages, but more like 40 to 50 pages as opposed to hundreds of pages. Obviously, there needs to be, some commonality in terms of what the priorities are and what the path forward is, but perhaps not addressing them in every level of detail at this point, but really trying to form that government as quickly as possible is the top priority.
I think there will be 2-3 issues which will be negotiated in advance. One is to lift the Schuldenbremse, to get hold of substantial money we can spend on defense. And there is talk of 500 billion euro, which would be breathtakingly lot, but that's the figure we're hearing. The other thing is, if the Social Democrats get in, they will go over some legal issues on migrational thing. They will follow the hard line, but they will stick on the social pact and the social issues, mostly the benefits for unemployed. There will be slight reforms, but in the end, everyone agrees. So even if you squeeze a little bit more, you might get out some few billions on that, but that's not getting 5 billion out of a social reform is not definitely the amount you need. What this country now needs for spending.
So in closing, let me just sort of pull these two threads together, if you will. I mean, obviously, you just touched on the debt brake, which is likely to be renegotiated and certainly loosened. You talk about the number of 500 billion for defense and for Ukraine as a breathtaking number. Is this something that should hopefully also impress the administration in Washington and be a sign that Germany is willing to step up and take on even more responsibility than it already has in dealing with the challenges facing Ukraine?
I honestly don't know if this administration wants to be impressed. They seem to make a business out of dealing with allies as they do. And it is much more now a question of impressing the European Union. Europe definitely needs leadership, and that's only what Germany can provide. France is too weak. Britain is out. Poland is not really amassing the weight to take over. So it will fall to Friedrich Merz. And they know in his camp that he will have to spend 70-80% of his time doing foreign policy, traveling Europe, bringing it together, forming unity, agreeing on essential reforms, on growth, on the economy, on dealing with China, on dealing with the US, on defense, also on our vulnerabilities, which are sort of societal vulnerabilities, which is social media, which is the technology issue, AI, so on. I mean, the list is endless. And Germany has been remarkably absent on the European stage for far too long now. Scholz was definitely not the EU guy. And I'm at least very hopeful that Merz will change that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Stefan, herzlichen Dank. I know that this is an insanely busy time for you, and I am all the more grateful that you took the time to talk with us today. I hope that we will have the opportunity to do this again in the not too distant future, because of course there is so much to talk about. But for now, many, many thanks.
Sure. Great to be with you and happy to do it again.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Bye. Cheers.